recording. So all right, so can everyone see my screen? So as I say, what I wish I knew before I taught online, distilled it into 4 different things. Quickly, just the context here is that I was teaching POLI 366, which is Topics in Political Theory. And the particular course title I gave it was Judgment, Pluralism, and Democracy. So we read people like Kant, Habermas, Arendt, many others. So it was a theory course, a lot of readings. And of course, many of the things I'm going to talk about were particular to this 5 weeks course where we met 4 days a week. So it was a fairly intense pace. And so one thing that would be much nicer is to be able to think about having 13 weeks to teach an online course. But so there was this sort of compounded by already an intensive pace plus doing it remotely. There were about 51 students, and the sort of content delivery that I employed, which I think a lot of people will do, is something like this, which is a combination of pre-recorded lectures, and then we'd have 80-minute live classroom discussions every day. So basically every evening I would release a pre-recorded lecture that they would have to watch, and then we'd meet the next morning for about 80 minutes. And the syllabus with the evaluation scheme and other things about the course is available. There's a link there if you're interested. So this would be my first piece of advice. And again, I'm trying to make this sort of very practical. So just get through the first week. So I sort of had this leading up to the week before the course as I was planning. I started to get a lot, very, very overwhelmed with all the things that I had to do to teach this 5-week course. And so I sort of just kept telling myself, get through the first week, get through the first week. There were dozens and dozens of tasks associated with the course, things that I wouldn't have even foreseen. And so when you think about other projects that we might undertake, whether it's writing a book or organizing a conference, we only complete this project by doing a series of discrete steps. We don't just, I didn't sit down and write my PhD thesis. I worked on chapter 1. I read an article related to chapter 1. And over time, the whole project got done. And I think thinking of a course in a similar way is helpful. So I specified, what are the concrete tasks that I need to do in order to get through week 1? So I have to do 4 pre-recorded lectures. I have to run 4 live class sessions. That's it. And then when Thursday came around, I took a deep breath and I said, you did it, you got through week 1. And then I thought about what I would have to do for week 2, and only week 2. One of the reasons I think this is important is because you should plan for your course, but you shouldn't plan too much because things are going to change. So if you spend a bunch of time trying to plan the entire course before it starts, you'll end up adjusting lots of things, and then this will be time wasted. So I would say do your best to put in place the kind of general architecture for the course, the evaluation scheme, the list of topics and readings, and so on. Don't feel like you have to figure everything out before day 1 because you really don't. And I think this is important for diminishing anxiety. Tackling an entire course online sounds really daunting. And one of the examples I use is just sort of like traveling to a city you've never been to, maybe a big city in a foreign country. And you're doing your research before and you think, I want to go see this thing and that thing. And you think, how am I going to do all this in the time that I'm there? But then you land and you start walking around and you realize certain things are closer together and you can see all those in one afternoon. And there's this other thing maybe that's further away and you say, okay, we got to get up one morning early to make sure we go see that thing. But, it's a lot easier once you've landed and you kind of have your bearings. So I think just, doing the immediate concrete things that you have to do in order to get through the first week is one thing that I would advise. And by the end of the first week, you've met your students, at least virtually. You feel a little more comfortable using the technology, running a class, things like that. And I think it'll make week 2 tasks seem a lot more manageable. So the second thing is just that your pre-recorded lectures are going to be imperfect, and that's okay. Because you're not a video editor, you don't have a YouTube channel, maybe some of you do, but probably not. Your job is to deliver content. So I can't tell you how much time I spent leading up to the first week trying to make these nearly perfect video recordings of my lectures. And, spoiler alert, I never succeeded in doing that. If you've never really done this sort of thing before, videotaping yourself, it's going to feel fairly awkward. I think there's something really sort of unsettling about watching yourself. I'll probably feel that way about this recording. I think, do I really look like that and sound like that? So don't watch yourself. I must have gone through a dozen or more takes the first time, the smallest hiccup, whether my cat starts meowing or I cough, and I take this as a reason to start over. We don't think this way about the live lectures we give in class, so why would we hold ourselves to higher standards just because it's being recorded? I think the answer might be, well, because it's being recorded and somehow it's, there permanently for all to see. But I think we have to move away from thinking like that. There's going to be potential disturbances that you don't have in class, whether it's kids or drilling outside or what have you. But if each of these things count as reasons for starting your recording over, you will quite literally never finish one pre-recorded lecture. And if you put yourself in your student's position, they're looking to understand the material so they can do well in the course. They're not paying attention to what you look like, judging you for, losing your train of thought for a moment or things like this. They just want the content to be delivered in a clear and accessible way. And so once you've accepted the fact that your pre-recorded lectures will never be perfect, you should also rest assured that they'll be much better than you actually think they are. We're our own worst critics, as I mentioned. And so I think if your students feel as if they're being presented the material in a way that's digestible, they're going to be happy. And so I've sort of broken it down into 5 easy steps here for pre-recording a lecture. First, you hit record, then you talk, then you hit stop, you don't watch it, and you post it to my courses. I know it sounds very simple, common sense. If someone would have told me this earlier, right at the beginning of the course, it would have saved me dozens of hours. In fact, I remember, I see Juliet is here. I remember talking to Juliet and saying, I don't know what to do. I record it and then I watch it. And then I remember distinctly, she said, well, that's your problem. You can't watch it. So, maybe if this is something that I encountered, it might be something you would encounter too. And so I highly recommend that you think like this when it comes to pre-recorded lectures. This is a big one, the third one, which is that I think in the online format, students will tend to either do extremely well or they will, let's say, not do extremely well. They'll fall off the map or something, very devastating will happen. I think you have, depending on the context that students are in, they will either be at home and they're kind of bored and they really throw themselves into the class. They get really engaged and excited and they do really well. I had a lot of students like this. You also have students who maybe they're in a different time zone or their family situation's not so good, mental health isn't good. They aren't coming to class. They clearly aren't watching the recordings. On my first quiz, I had, I think, 20 A's and 20 F's. So it was really, quite shocking. And so what could I say about this? Well, I think the moral of the story is that we need to assess accordingly. I would recommend lots of low stakes assignments, things that to the best of our ability can try and keep students engaged. And the one thing I want to just talk about briefly is this thing that I did that I think really worked. And I think it could be adapted to a lot of different arts disciplines. So it's called a question for consideration, or QFC for short. They had to do one every single day. And it wasn't just a one-line discussion question. It was what I would call like a robust discussion question. So it ended up being like half a page or even sometimes upwards of a full page. And they had to do a handful of things. So I posted the instructions here, but they had to locate a question based on a particular quotation. So they had to tie it to a particular passage, put the page number, and in addition to raising a question that had some kind of, in my case, theoretical, philosophical import, they had to say something about why it was a question we should be asking, and they had to hazard a guess. So they had to say, based on what Kant says on this other page, it may be that what Kant would say is, and they would give their own educated guess. So it was graded on a rubric out of 15 points. and I dropped the lowest 2 of them at the end of the course. But there are a number of reasons I think that this is a really useful thing to do. It's low stakes. They were around 2% each. But I would review them each morning before class. It would give me an idea of what people tended to find interesting or confusing. The page numbers allowed me to sort of structure our discussion in a kind of coherent way. It forced people to take us to exactly the spot that was the source of their question. And it functioned as a starting point for discussions in breakout groups and general participation. So at a certain point, QFC became such a familiar term in the course. Students would say things like, oh, I was wondering, I talk about in my QFC this or that. And I think a lot of students at the beginning found this to be a very demanding part of the course. They thought every single day we have to do a QFC. But by the end of the course, there were many who found it to be the most valuable part of the course, because I had some testimonials here, but forced us to keep up to date with the readings, engage with them, help them improve their writing skills. And I had students turn QFCs into papers by the end. I had students say that, I really would have probably skimmed a lot of the readings if I didn't have to do a QFC. And then they showed up to class, I think, more than they maybe would have, because they'd already done something and then they had something to talk about. And so this really, it wasn't even very intentional on my part, but became kind of the cornerstone, if you will, of the course. So I think these kinds of things could be, adapted to different disciplines. So maybe if you're in history, questions that have a kind of historical import, or in English, a literary import, these kinds of things. I think you could sort of tweak these guidelines I have here for that. I also did, and I won't talk about it now, but in the discussion we can talk about it, a multi-stage, or as they call it, scaffolded assignment for the final essay. So I had them write it in 4 different stages. And so these general things where you break it down, you have them working in stages on lower stakes things, I think will do a lot to prevent, to the best of our ability, students from totally sinking and being in danger of failing the course. Finally, communication is key. So I have a picture of my cat there because I was told, and I would highly recommend, if you have pets, show your pets to your students. It does a lot to humanize you. My cat's actually sleeping right there right now, but if he wakes up, I'll show you. I did surveys. I know Brahm's going to talk more about this. A week before the course started, I sent out a survey just to learn some things about the students, challenges that they anticipated, things like this. And a few weeks into the course, I did a survey. How are things going? And I learned a lot. There were some things that were surprising, and that I wouldn't have guessed. They wanted less breakout sessions. They wanted more time to discuss as a class and have me explain things, and a number of other things. So I know we're running short of time here, so I won't say too much more on this. But things like surveying your students, showing them that you're interested in tailoring the course to their needs, that you're willing to adjust. I know these are things Brahm's going to talk about as well. It really goes a long way. They really appreciate it. Obviously, we have to do this within reason. We can't assign 2 pages of reading a night just because they want fewer readings or something like that. But there are a lot of things we can do if we just asked them and learned about what was most helpful for them to learn in this new and unusual format. I think it will go a long way. You can hang out after class as well, just like you would in person. And even, you're probably wondering why I have a Wheel of Fortune image there next to my cat. I did a survey, and to incentivize people, I raffled off a book. So I said, if you fill out the survey, you'll get entered into this raffle to win a book. And then I said, don't be late on Monday. I'm going to spin the wheel, and someone's going to win a book, and, make sure you don't miss out on this. So things like this that are easy to do and fun and keep the students engaged, I think all fall under the banner of, communication frequently with your students. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Brahm.
You're muted, Brahm.
Sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm Brahm Kleinman. As Mike said before, I'm a faculty lecturer in history and classical studies. And so I want to talk about in this presentation my experience teaching class 215 this summer. Class 215 is an intensive introductory Latin class. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned from it, how I put the class together, and then building off of Nick's last slide, how communication, experimentation, flexibility, and surveying were really important for me in putting the class together and then modifying the class slightly to better engage students and to create the best possible learning environment. And I think one thing I really learned from this class, I mean, look, this fall semester, we're all going to be teaching very different kinds of courses. I'm going to be teaching courses that are quite different from introductory Latin. I'll be teaching big history surveys. And the thing I really learned this summer is there is unfortunately no technology, no software that is a silver bullet that will solve all of our online teaching problems. In practice, there are going to be difficulties that we run into that we didn't anticipate. Some of the tools we use will not work as intended, and we have to give ourselves some flexibility to be able to change along the way, I believe, to create the best class possible. Now, one of the themes is improvisation, and putting this class together was in itself an act of improvisation. The Latin intensive class normally works like this. We have 6 weeks to teach students an entire year's worth of Latin. So that's 2 semesters worth of Latin, including Latin grammar, morphology, and vocabulary, with the goal of preparing them to then be able to enter intermediate Latin in the fall and read real Latin texts. In a normal semester, a class like this is usually offered over the course of 6 weeks, usually in class for about 4 to 5 to even 6 hours a day. And in the classroom, you'll be doing lots of different things with the students. There will be interactive lecturing where you're teaching them new material and having them ask questions of you as you teach them. There's going to be homework review as a class. And then, of course, usually as an instructor, you provide group work for them to do, drills, other activities to space things out. So that's the basic structure of a normal introductory intensive Latin class. Putting this together into an online class was an act of improvisation because, as I'm sure you all remember, the end of the winter semester was essentially a race to the finish as we were all forced to adapt our classes, sometimes very different classes that we were teaching, to the online model. And then, of course, there was a lot of grading. And my class started May 19th, so only a few weeks after the end of winter semester. And so I didn't have a lot of time to figure things out. But this is the basic structure I decided on, partially on the basis of my experience teaching Latin classes and intensive Latin classes before, partially on the basis of reading online pedagogy, and then also, as I'll talk a bit about later, surveying my students. What I decided on was a mix of asynchronous and synchronous teaching. The most important thing I learned from reading online pedagogy about online learning, is that I could not have my students in a Zoom call for 4 to 6 hours a day. That would benefit nobody. So I organized the class like this. There were asynchronous, a lot of the material was asynchronous. In other words, I would post it ahead of time. And so for each day on the syllabus and in my courses, there were a series of chapters in the Latin textbook that they had to cover. And so, for example, on May 13th, as you see here, they have to do chapters 3 and chapter 4. For each chapter, I included a PowerPoint, which summarized and explained slightly differently the material they were learning in that chapter. Just about every PowerPoint slide had either an audio file or a video file embedded into it. So they get the experience of a lecture if they want to hear a longer explanation of concepts. Alongside these PowerPoints, as you can see on the side here, they could just click on, say, neuter, noun, adjective declension, and there would be a drill for them to do online, which would correct itself so they could see and measure their own progress. And then I also included things like discussion boards for them to be able to ask questions. And I hoped to engage with each other if they were having difficulty with Latin. And I even encouraged use of discussion boards through participation, giving them participation grades. On the other hand, I didn't want to get rid of synchronous learning entirely. I strongly believe that in language acquisition and learning, it is very important to have an interactive classroom. And so I wanted to recreate that as much as possible. In the end, there were about 36 students in the class. I split them into 2 Zoom groups, and I would meet with each group for 1 hour every day. So one group met at 10, one group met at 12. And so that was the basics for how I organized the class. And of course, there were 2 quizzes a week, homework assignments they had to submit, and I would provide comments on, and a midterm and final exam. Now, part of the reason I organized the class this way is because of my surveying of students before the class. Like Nick did, I sent out a survey about 2 weeks before class began. Now, of course, there are some problems with doing a survey this early. There's no guarantee with add drop the students who are responding to the survey will be the ones who actually end up in the class. And of course, we have to make these surveys optional. We shouldn't be forcing students to fill out surveys or to give information they don't want to. But by surveying students before the class began, and really a vast majority of students completed the survey, I gained an understanding of the different issues that might face them as I adapted the class to distance education, and I organized the online course in a way that could appeal to their interests. So I used SurveyMonkey for these surveys, which so far has been a very useful website for me and has worked very well. I do have to warn you, as I learned just this week, if you are doing this for a larger class, I sent out a survey for a 200-person class. After 40 responses, you unfortunately have to pay for a monthly membership to be able to see more than 40 responses. So I bought a membership for the month to be able to do this. I think it was $30 Canadian. You may not want to. Now, the questions I asked on a survey like this range from the very practical. Do you have the technology, or do you feel you have the technology to be able to engage in this class? Do you have a computer, reliable Wi-Fi, data, etc.? And through this question, most students will say yes, but you can see ahead of time if some students are going to have problems the way you're planning things. I also ask about time zones. And then I ask also about more content questions. In this survey, I asked why are they taking Latin? Do they have any particular eras that they're interested in? And that allows me to get a sense of students' interest. And then finally, the last question I always ask is, just a general, do you have any concerns about the class as we transition into this online model? And this question is especially useful because it lets you see what the most common anxieties about whatever class you're offering is. Now, I said the theme of this presentation was flexibility, and it is, but in the description that Mike sent out, and as Nick already said in his presentation, flexibility within reason. None of us have the time to be able to completely alter our syllabus just on the basis of one survey. But by using surveying early on, you can show students that you're thinking about their experience and make even seemingly minor changes to address their needs that will make them feel more comfortable with the class. So for this Latin class, to give a few concrete examples, I found that many of my students were interested in Renaissance and medieval Latin. Now, I'm a Roman historian. I mainly read Roman Latin. The textbook we're using was a Roman Latin textbook. But because so many of my students were, for example, interested in theology, I included texts that could appeal to them, like St. Augustine, or I found one medieval saint's life that involved a zombie story. And so I included that to appeal to both students who like zombie stories and also students who are interested in medieval Latin. And then also, I found out, most importantly through this survey, that students wanted a daily classroom experience of some kind. They wanted more synchronous learning. And this was one of the reasons I chose to make synchronous Zoom sessions happen every day. My original plan had been for them to happen every 2 days, but I made this a more central part of the class and I made them mandatory, which is possible for this class, it will probably not be possible for all classes in the fall. Okay, so all that was before the class actually started. I came up with a plan, I came up with a syllabus, I organized the class. I started the very long task of making PowerPoint presentations, audio recordings, video recordings. As Nick says, do not listen to these once you've recorded them. That is the best advice I think you can receive. Then May 19th came, our live classes began, and of course, not everything worked as I thought it would. I thought, for example, that discussion boards would be a great tool for students to ask and answer each other's questions with my input. I thought it would be a great way for them to build community with each other. And again, I had included a participation mark for engaging with discussion boards. Beyond that, I even created a separate a Discord server for students, so they could also ask questions of each other without me being there. I thought that might help build community also. Unfortunately, basically none of the students wanted to use these things. Sure, I had a few very keener students who asked lots of questions on the discussion board. It was helpful for them. The vast majority of students did not want to use them. As I found out later in the semester, many students were worried, quote unquote, that their questions might appear stupid to other students, that other people would be judging them for their questions. They didn't like this idea of their questions and comments being permanent. Even though I tried to emphasize to them, in language learning, no question is stupid. We all make mistakes as we're learning languages. That's part of the process. It still made them uncomfortable. One of my Zoom classes, meanwhile, was going very well, melding together as a community. The other of my Zoom classes, I was having more of a problem with. So I could sense some things weren't working as well as I'd hoped. But in general, I think a problem with online teaching, at least for me, I find it much harder to gauge the atmosphere of a class. In person in a classroom, I can usually sense when something isn't working and react accordingly. In an online class, especially one with so much asynchronous content, it's hard to get a sense for how students are doing. And so at this point, like Nick, I also surveyed my class again. This was an anonymous survey, so a slightly different technique than Nick, who I assume because of his giveaway with the Wheel of Fortune, asked students to give their names. I chose to do it anonymously to try to maybe encourage students to feel free to let loose. I think you could go either way. And I asked questions about every aspect of the class, basically. The PowerPoints, the quizzes, how effective the Zoom classes were, if they had any concerns 2 weeks in that I could perhaps address. And I got very, very, very useful feedback from the survey. Now, of course, it must be said, in a survey like this, you're going to get contradictory feedback. Not every student's going to want the same thing. Most students, for example, in this survey said they wanted more live Zoom time. They wanted more live Zoom classes. But some students, a minority of students, felt that an hour a day was really the maximum amount of time that they could do. I felt both sides had their points, and so I didn't want to make a major change here. And again, I emphasize it's unrealistic for us to radically change a class a third of the way in. But reading the feedback with an open mind and being willing to be flexible on certain issues, I really think really improved the quality of the class and student engagement with it. One popular student request was to use more of the live Zoom time to introduce them to new material. Before this, I've been mainly using those live Zoom classes for them to ask questions and also to go over homework together as a group. And I thought, look, all the new material is available in their textbook. It's available in their PowerPoints that I'm giving them. They don't need me to go over it in live class, but students did want this. And as I quickly learned when I began doing this, when I began teaching more using the Zoom time, I teach better when there's an audience. You know, when you're holed up in your room or in your apartment for 3 hours talking just to yourself and your computer about the ablative case, it can be hard to muster up a lot of enthusiasm. Meanwhile, if I'm speaking to a group of people, I find I just naturally am a more enthusiastic teacher. And it also means, of course, students can ask me questions as I'm teaching them. And that means, of course, I think of things that I wasn't thinking of when I was just recording my lecture by itself. and I do a better job, I think, of at least introducing them to new concepts. This was a major change I made to class structure on the basis of the survey. For quizzes, before this, I'd given students the same amount of time as I would in a regular Latin class for my quizzes. But students fairly pointed out in the survey that writing a quiz in a classroom environment, even in one like Leacock where there's like 10 different drills happening at the same time, is a different game than writing a quiz in, say, a cramped apartment where you have roommates or family members who are coming in and out of the picture. And so I gave them an extra 5 minutes on quizzes. Again, as Nick says, we can't change everything for students just because they want it. Of course, students would have wanted an extra 20 minutes on quizzes, but I felt 5 minutes was a fair compromise and seemed to match the needs of the class. I also de-emphasized discussion boards. I prepared different kinds of handouts and worksheets for them than I had been doing before. And so these were some fairly minor, but I think effective changes I made. Now, with all these changes, was this suddenly the greatest intensive Latin class ever offered? Probably not. But overall, students seemed happy with the changes. And by communicating with them throughout this process, I think the class melded together more as a community. Sorry, I meant to flip to this slide earlier, but I forgot to. This is kind of just a summary of some of the changes that I made. In general, I think, and this is kind of me wrapping things up, throughout the semester, I learned a lot from being willing to try new things, being willing to experiment with different kinds of slides in the PowerPoint, with different kinds of drills. Early on, I had this very strange drill where I had them pretend to be helping Cicero parse noun-adjective pairings. So I tried to experiment with lots of different things like this. Not all of them worked, of course, but some of them did, and there'll be some things that I'll use again if I ever offer this class again online. And my experience in this class is informing my approach to how I teach my 2 classes in the fall, especially using surveying and remaining flexible as tools to find the right methods and approaches for each individual class. Again, my methods in Intro Latin are probably not going to work in my 200-person ancient history survey, but I've already sent out surveys this week to both of my classes for the upcoming fall semester. I'm especially interested in finding out what students think about different alternate participation models, like online group projects, discussion boards, using software like Perusal. And on the basis of the survey, I'll decide what I'm going to do, but I will keep things open enough in my classes so that if I'm assigning Perusal assignments, but they work for one class, but not the other class, I can keep it in one class, but not the other class, and try something new. So yes, just keeping an open mind, being willing to improvise. These are things I think that that can benefit us all as we move into this experimental new semester. Thank you.